I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we relay reports of drone strikes on St Petersburg over the weekend and Ukrainian attacks on Russian railway bridges. Plus, we discuss the fallout of one of Germany's worst security breaches since the Cold War.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 4th of March, 2 years and 9 days since the full-scale invasion began. As our regular host, David Knowles, travels back from Ukraine, today in the studio I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls. Later, we run an extraordinary interview with Anastasiia Lapatina, a reporter at the Kyiv Independent, about her experience giving birth during an airstrike. First, though, over to Dom for the latest military updates from Ukraine.
Well, hi Francis, and hi everybody. So let's get back over the weekend for starters. So from Saturday, St Petersburg was hit in another drone attack. This is coming from Russia's state news agency, RIA Novosti. They said a Ukrainian drone hit an apartment building in St Petersburg, injuring 6. The explosion early on Monday morning. They published a video showing the moment of impact. Then on Sunday, interesting daily military intelligence tweet from Britain's MOD. They said that February saw the bloodiest month so far for Russia since the start of the full-scale invasion. They said the recent gains that Russia's made, obviously most particularly around Avdiivka, came at a cost of over 29,000 men killed or wounded in February alone. They said the increase in the daily average almost certainly reflects Russia's commitment to mass and attritional warfare, which we've seen a lot of over the last couple of years. So data for the last 4 months, Britain's MOD are saying the Russian army, very specific here, sustained an average of 936 casualties every day. Now, casualties being killed, wounded, missing, or taken prisoner. So not just killed, which obviously many people get wrong. But 936 is a very specific figure, but is huge. It's 4 or 5 times higher than Russia's losses in the first few months after February 2022. They showed a graph comparing the monthly casualties from 22, 23 and the first couple of months of 24. Each month, year on year, is higher than the 1 year before. It's just staggering, which speaks to, we've seen the tactics they're using. You've heard the term meat assaults. This is just human wave type attacks as equipment has been worn down, but also, just as importantly, experienced personnel are no longer there. So Russia's increasingly relying on very unskilled, ill-equipped and poorly led individuals just running at Ukrainian guns. So that's a mix of the two. You're going to get much higher casualties. Of course, the question is, who's going to last the longest? Ukraine's ammunition or Russian personnel? An issue we've spoken of quite recently, and we will continue to do so. Then, continuing the news from today, Ukraine says it has blown up a railway bridge this morning in Russia's southwestern Samara region, southwest for Russia, but still about 500 kilometres southeast of Moscow. Ukraine said that this line was being used to transport military cargo in aid of their efforts in Ukraine. This incident is the latest in a string of explosions targeting Russia's rail network across the country. Kyiv says Moscow says it's using the railway lines increasingly to move troops and equipment into Ukraine. A statement from the Ukrainian Armed Forces said a railway bridge over the Chapayivka River in Russia's Samara region was blown up this morning around 6 a.m. local time. The bridge was damaged by blowing up its support structures. That came from Ukraine's military intelligence. Now, the blast, we think, was from the line out of an ammunition plant in the town of Chapayevsk, the name where the river comes from. Also today, NATO kicking off the latest part in its sort of 6-month huge steadfast defender exercise. So this massive 6-month exercise, there's lots of moving parts to it, lots of different elements of the military being exercised and different geographic areas. So this morning they're looking at Finland, Norway and Sweden. So the expanded Nordic territory, more than 20,000 soldiers from 13 nations taking part in this particular exercise lasting more than a couple of weeks. The Finnish Defence Minister said in a statement, for the first time, Finland will participate as a NATO member in exercising collective defence of the alliance's regions. Now, a couple of other things that caught my attention today. You may remember Russia's supertank, the T14 Armata, 3-person crew, self-loader, auto-loader, so far so similar, but all the crew in the hull, so the turret it doesn't have anyone in it, aids survivability, new engine, automatic protection system, all that kind of jazz. Trouble is, it's never been seen anywhere other than pouncing up and down on Red Square. Now, unlikely that it's going to be seen in Ukraine either, but apparently it's due to the high cost and the fact that it's easier to buy T90. So this comes from the General Director of the Rostec State Corporation, Sergei Chemasov, speaking to RIA Novosti. He said, Armata is, of course, much superior to existing tanks, but it's too expensive, so the army is unlikely to use it now. He said, now we need money to create new tanks, new weapons, perhaps cheaper ones. Therefore, if there's an opportunity to buy cheaper ones, why not? So, well, fair enough. You knew that before you started building it, Sergei. Anyway, Francis Scarr of BBC Monitoring, you'll see him on Twitter. He says, so it was designed and built solely for Victory Day parades on Red Square, by the sound of it. They've talked about this new tank. We think it's only been built in very, very low hundreds, 200 or 300 models, and only ever really in prototype form. It's been seen on the kind of tank drills and goodness knows what else, but it's never been seen in combat, never been seen in Ukraine. It's thought to have all sorts of problems. So unsurprising that they're now saying, actually, no, it's easier to buy cheaper kit. Like, yeah, fine. And just finally on the news, I'd draw your attention to Ombre Intelligence, a risk management firm. They put out a report this morning saying that the armed forces of Ukraine have destroyed a contact-triggered YARM-type anti-landing sea mine. This was discovered on the beach of Odessa. So these mines, they are in shallow water, so they're not supposed to be out in deep sea. They are to stop amphibious assaults. They're generally placed in water no deeper than about meters. You can drop them off the side of a small boat. They're designed to float just below the surface, and they've got a trigger on top, big metal arms that stick out from the top. And when they are hit by about a kilogram's worth of force, the charge goes off. It's designed to burst holes in ships as opposed to the big kind of sea mines, which are designed to blast all the water from underneath the ship and for a fraction of a second create a hole in the water underneath the ship, which the ship then falls into and breaks its back and sinks. That's what sea mines do. If you just blow holes in ships, that's good, but actually ships should have drills to be able to seal off those areas, and they can take quite a lot of water on board before they go down. Create enough holes, it will of course go down, but actually just blowing holes in the side like these things doesn't break the back of the ship. That's what the biggies do, but these are nonetheless very effective. Now, it can stay in position in a current of up to about a metre a second, but if you look at the flooding from the Kakhovka Dam destruction, that has likely displaced a load of YARM mines that would have been up and down the Dnipro trying to guard against any kind of amphibious crossing getting across the river. Then they have probably all flowed downstream and are now in the Black Sea and popping up on beaches and elsewhere. So that's enough about the mine. It was controlled detonation that destroyed it, and Ombre say that it showed a lot of growth on the surface, suggesting it's been there for quite some time, possibly since the start of the full-scale invasion. Shipments of North Korean artillery shells to Russia look like they may have stopped, or at least slowed down. This comes from South Korean analysts. Satellite photos show that 4 Russian container ships that have been documented or regularly seen picking up suspected arms supplies have not docked in North Korea since February the 12th. So this comes from NK Pro, a commercial analytics firm which specialises in research on North Korea. They say it's unclear if this is due to production problems at North Korea's weapons factories or another issue. North Korea does not appear to have delivered containers to the export pier during that time. They're looking at satellite photos there. Now, these 4 Russian container ships were named: the Lady R, the Angara, the Maya 1 and the Maria. NK Pro said they have previously made 32 trips between North Korea and Russia since August. That was when Kim Jong-un agreed to send weapons in exchange for space technology. And we think, as a reminder, North Korea sent about 3 million artillery shells to Russia, which could well have tipped the scales in Avdiivka area. And I will take a little pause there, Francis.
Thanks, Dom. An eventful weekend. Now, last week, Germany's Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, sparked tensions among Kyiv's allies by claiming publicly that British special forces are in Ukraine, assisting the Ukraine armed forces to use Storm Shadow missiles, and by slamming Macron's mooting of the possibility that NATO forces might, in extremis, be required in Ukraine at some stage. Now, if Scholz was doing so to try and keep the war at an arm's distance, then it has backfired, with a urgent investigation being launched in Germany over the weekend after a highly sensitive conversation was leaked by a Russian state-backed TV channel between senior German military officials about sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine. So on Friday night, after our broadcast, the head of RT, formerly known as Russia Today, following all of that row last week, published the transcript of a lengthy discussion between German military chiefs about the potential use of Taurus missiles by the Ukrainians. In that leaked recording, German officials also discussed details of how Britain and France support Ukraine with similar missile systems and the possibility that German missiles might be used to strike the strategically important Crimean Bridge if they were delivered to Kyiv. Now, the leaked audio and transcript of the conversation does appear to be authentic, not least due to the Bundestag's reaction, but also from the Der Spiegel, which investigated the claims initially, citing experts. Now, if this conversation is indeed confirmed to have been intercepted by Russia, it would potentially mark one of Germany's worst security breaches since the Cold War. The speculation is the leak happened by using off-the-shelf video phone technology to discuss the missiles in Ukraine. The head of the Luftwaffe and a general who dialed in from his hotel room are both implicated in the security breach. Boris Pistorius, the German defence minister, said on Sunday that Putin was using the recording to try and destabilise Germany, sowing divisions with an information war. Suffice to say, this is an embarrassing story, with senior military figures in Britain and elsewhere now saying publicly that the German military has been compromised by Russian infiltration. This has been an accusation made for some time now, as regular listeners will recall. But what makes this leak especially surprising, I think, is that it comes despite the fact that Germany is seen by many as being quite helpful to Moscow at present by its refusing to send Taurus missiles and by its fears of a nuclear escalation. The fact that Russia decided to leak this should really wake up Berlin to the fact that one cannot de-escalate this war by appeasing Moscow. The Kremlin will come for you anyway. It sees itself as at war with you. Now, on that subject, Russia's former president Dmitry Medvedev, donning what I can only describe as a blue version of Dr. Evil's outfit from Austin Powers, check it out if you don't believe me, has today publicly stated on Russian TV that the concept of an independent Ukrainian identity must disappear for good. He had a map of Ukraine projected behind him, showing those parts of the country he deemed Russian and those he deemed Ukrainian. Essentially, the entire country is shown in the same red colour as Russia, with only Kyiv and the surrounding region being Ukrainian. Medvedev is often seen as merely a loose cannon by many Western experts, operating under his own volition. But that misunderstands his role. He isn't really an outlier, an eccentric, but an essential part of the Kremlin apparatus. He says the quiet bit out loud. He dangles it publicly, pitching to a different audience in Russia and also shifting the dial regarding of the framing of the conversation about Ukraine. Over time, many may actually start to believe that large portions of Ukraine are Russian. Others in the West may hear what he says and start to think that letting Russia keep Crimea and the occupied territories doesn't sound so bad after all, if this is the possible alternative. So yes, we shouldn't take what he says as being a verbatim summary of the Kremlin's goals, but we shouldn't see him as being a separate entity from the state. He is part of the organ of propaganda, and that in itself is important and revealing. Now, there is evidence that the West, including Germany, is slowly waking up to this new reality. I was quite struck to see a German foreign minister today say that delaying EU accession for the countries of the Western Balkans risked leaving them open to Russian infiltration. She said, taking the 6 states in the region under our wing on their way into the European Union has become a geopolitical necessity in light of Russia's brutal imperialism. We cannot allow any grey zones in Europe, and together we must do everything we can to protect the flanks that Russia can use for destabilisation, disinformation and infiltration. Now, I know many of you at home will be crying out "Alleluia" to hear that reference to grey zones. And in a story that seems to have slipped under the radar, a story out of Taiwan reported over the weekend that US Special Forces troops will be permanently stationed in Taiwan, according to Taiwan's United Daily News. It will be the American 1st Special Forces Group, deployed for a permanent training mission on the island. We don't exactly know what the terms of this agreement are, but it does speak, I think, to a more assertive Western foreign policy in territories that autocracies think they can manipulate or seize by force. And of course, there remains this open question whether, if there had been NATO forces stationed at the invitation of President Zelensky in Ukraine, whether that would have been enough to deter Putin, or whether he would have struck anyway, one for the historians. Now, lastly, a quick update on the aftermath of the funeral of Russian opposition figure Alexei Navalny. Hundreds of Russians have visited his grave over the weekend to pay their respects and leave flowers. Despite warnings from the Kremlin that they faced arrest, thousands came out for the official funeral service on Friday, as we reported live on the podcast, with officers ordering mourners to keep moving as they laid stacks of red and white roses and incarnations. The photographs of the grave today are striking. I think many observers have been taken by surprise by the number of people who have braved arrest in order to pay their respects. I think we should remember that whenever we have these comments and commentary on the state of Russian opposition. Many people will be afraid to go out, but many were not. And if we see, I don't know, as every person who was brave enough as being representative of maybe several hundred others who weren't, then that is telling us something. But anyway, a lot going on. Dom, before we discuss an important long read in the New York Times, which caused a bit of a stir last week, I'm intrigued by your reaction to the German leaks story. What do you think as a former military man when you hear about a leak of this magnitude?
Well, I've had mates who've left discs on trains and been sacked for it and all the rest of it. So part of me, when I see this, thinks, thank God it wasn't me or anyone I know. But yes, it's embarrassing. Yes, it was very stupid. Whether or not it hints at a systemic problem in the way the German military and political and security apparatus handles very sensitive information, that's to be seen, I think. It has happened in the past. We had a very senior Whitehall British official here who left top secret documents in a Sainsbury's supermarket bag at a bus stop a couple of years ago. And we've also more recently seen Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. She got caught in that sort of crank call. So it happens. There's a lot of activity here, secret TS and above that as well. So, you know, a part of it is the numbers game. Eventually, it will. Someone's going to cock up. It happens to be Germany in the context of Taurus, which is doing the rounds at the moment. So very, very unhelpful timing. I doubt. So Lieutenant General Ingo Gerhardt's head of the Luftwaffe is probably going to be getting his carriage clock soon and a nice retirement party. But, you know, like I say, does it hint at something systemic? I mean, the fact that they were using publicly available technical means is not in and of itself a red line. If you've got sufficient security protocols and software installed, then that's probably fine. I mean, you've got to buy this stuff from somewhere. You can't bespoke build everything. But it's how they were using it, what they were talking about, the means that they were, or some of the conversations that were probably, even if they had rated whatever the system they were using up to secret, and I doubt you can get above that with looking at the stuff that they'd bought, some of the conversations had probably strayed above it. So the lack of awareness to say, right, we need to take this offline or stop the conversation now and continue elsewhere, that was not very sensible. And also the suggestion that they're going to carry on some of the conversation or send you some details on WhatsApp. I mean, no. How many times do you have to read Boris Johnson's Partygate bloody WhatsApps before you think, just don't go to WhatsApp, fellas. Do something else. Do something else. So, yeah, is it systemic or was it 3 or 4 people who really, really should have known better? I don't know if we'll ever find out unless we see some sort of root and branch reform in the German security apparatus, which may happen. I doubt it. But what I would say was, interesting the reaction. You saw this rather muted response from Russia. The German ambassador to Moscow, Germany has denied that the ambassador has been summoned to the Russian Foreign Ministry. He has gone there, apparently, but we're told that was for a long-standing diary engagement. So, Russia haven't gone bells and whistles on this, and you expect they've probably got more than we've heard about in the public domain. I've been trying to speak to officials and serving figures here in London, but everyone's very tight-lipped. I think maybe because we don't really know yet, or certainly they're not hinting to me. But what I would say was that this conversation or hints and comments in these conversations that either directly or implied Western boots on the ground in Ukraine, where's the reaction from Russia? I mean, very, very often you hear Putin totally losing it and leaping from one very small thing to suddenly rattling the nuclear sabre. And they've talked about a red line if NATO puts troops in and all this kind of stuff. But here we are again. This conversation is now becoming almost common knowledge. We can cite a number of examples where so-and-so has said or referred to NATO troops on the ground in this capacity or that capacity. And there's not been a huge reaction from Russia. Now, I'm not saying, come on then, come and show your nukes if you're hard enough. I'm not saying that. But equally, it's almost as if we're getting slowly anaesthetised to this, and it's going to be common knowledge. I mean, remember when Ukraine taking the fight inside Russia was supposedly a red line, and then it was Ukraine doing that with Western weapons, and there's been many accusations that that's happened. And so as much as we allow Putin to in many ways lead the narrative about escalation, and many people in the West, we talked about it at length last week, but elsewhere as well, many people are allowing themselves to be deterred and go, oh my God, it's escalatory, it's going to be nuclear war. Too many people are jumping that way. But also Putin and the system, the Kremlin, is talking about, well, that's going to be a red line. And then that's breached and broached by leak and hack and by cock up. And it's like, oh, well, they didn't really do anything about it. So I just wonder if there's any way to, I mean, I'm not trying to spin this as good news at all, but the palpable lack of reaction from Russia, I mean, there's not an awful lot they can do in the diplomatic. So I just find that strikes me as interesting. It's early days. It's only happened in the last few hours, or the news has only come out in the last few hours. But yeah, the very muted, lukewarm, limp response from Moscow, I think, is somewhat telling, Francis.
Thanks, Dom. It certainly is, and it's an interesting one. To your question about how systemic it is, on Germany, I think there is evidence of a historic fragility with regards to Russia in Germany's intelligence context, but very much welcome listeners' perspectives on that, particularly people who've studied this. Now, staying on the intelligence field, let's turn then to this long read in the New York Times of last week. It's called The Spy War: How the CIA Secretly Helps Ukraine Fight Putin, and summarises a decade of intelligence cooperation between Kyiv and Washington, speaking to key officials on and off the record. It offers a timeline of the tensions and revelations that have been afforded for both sides by the relationship, as well as the current state of play. It begins by talking about subterranean bunkers where teams of Ukrainian soldiers track Russian spy satellites and eavesdrop on conversations between Russian commanders, a base that it calls almost fully financed and partly equipped by the CIA. As the paper writes, the relationship took root a decade ago, coming together in fits and starts under 3 very different US presidents, pushed forward by key individuals who often took daring risks. It has transformed Ukraine, whose intelligence agencies were long seen as thoroughly compromised by Russia, into one of Washington's most important intelligence partners against the Kremlin today. It goes on, the listening post in the Ukrainian forest is part of a CIA-supported network of spy bases constructed in the past 8 years that includes 12 secret locations along the Russian border. Before the war, the Ukrainians proved themselves to the Americans by collecting intercepts that helped prove Russia's involvement in the 2014 downing of a commercial jetliner, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. The Ukrainians also helped the Americans go after the Russian operatives who meddled in the 2016 US presidential election. Now, this piece is too detailed to be able to provide a comprehensive summary of here, links in the show notes as ever, but it talks through the relationship until the full-scale invasion and how CIA officers were the only US government presence on the ground when the invasion actually happened, offering invaluable intelligence to the Ukrainians in a way that they had been cautious to do before the full-scale invasion. And it speaks, I think, once again to the core role of intelligence in this war and the way in which Ukraine, as I say, has become a core part of the Western intelligence sharing network as a response. It's another example of those long-term trends which further cement one of the ways the Kremlin has been fundamentally defeated from its core objectives in this war. Kyiv is now far more integrated into the Western security apparatus than it was beforehand. Now, I'm frankly quite surprised that people are surprised about this story. Of course, the CIA are going to be working closely with the Ukrainians and assisting them. So are many other Western defence agencies. The real story is how, I think, the relationship has evolved to where it is today, which this piece details in a way that we have not yet seen prior to now. But Dom, what were your thoughts on it?
Well, I think I was equally amazed that it was able to be produced. And yeah, I was slightly, like you were, Francis, surprised that it came as a big shock. I mean, the detail is very, very impressive. They've done a great job here, New York Times, about locations and interviews and what have you. But if the headline is Western intelligence agencies helping Ukraine, that is no longer a headline. We know that. We see regularly, for example, aircraft in international airspace, but over the Black Sea, RC-135 rivet joint for the RAF. These are electronic surveillance aircraft. We know that the US have been flying MQ-9 Reapers. We saw that incident where a Russian jet dumped a load of fuel over the Reaper, destabilised it. It crashed. So these things are out there and flying, and we know, as in the public know, and so you bet yourself that Russia knows what they're doing. They are hoovering up signals and other telemetry and all sorts of stuff for analysts to turn that into intelligence and work out quite what's happening on the ground. So this is known. Of course, Russia will suspect that stuff is happening on the ground. They'd be daft not to. So would they be surprised by this? I don't think so. I think they'll try and make hay. But a bit like what I was saying earlier on, if this is yet more proof, in funny bunny ears, proof that NATO, Western forces have personnel from military and intelligence agencies operating on the ground, I mean, I don't think that will come as a surprise to Russia. And what's their response going to be? So, yeah, I think it's a fascinating article. It's a good New York Times article, so take the whole of your lunch hour to read it. You're not going to get it done on the bus. But no, it's very, very interesting. I thought it was great in detail from a known point, I think. So, yeah, a helpful contribution. But in and of itself, I didn't think it broke any new news, if you know what I mean.
Well, thanks for that, Dom. And for anyone wondering, our usual host, David Nicholls, is currently travelling back from Ukraine with our producer, Adley. So he'll be back in the seat on Wednesday with Dom in the seat tomorrow. A lot of interviews still to come out from our time in Ukraine. Really interesting on a myriad of subjects. So do bear with us as we edit them and dub them where necessary. But Dom, because we've got a really interesting interview coming out at the end of today's episode, a little shorter one today from us, but what are your final thoughts?
Well, everything that we've spoken about today, about the issue in Germany and the New York Times article, I was looking at the newsletter from Phillips OBrien, Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews, well worth a follow and subscribe to the newsletter. He was talking this week about the Soviet-era concept of reflexive control. And he says this is the means by which you try to influence over an opponent by affecting their way of thinking, to shape their way of viewing a question, your adversary's way of viewing a question, so they do what you want to do before you have to take any action. And he said that Putin's ability to limit the aid that's been given to Ukraine, especially by the USA, the thing held up in Congress, and Germany here we've been talking about today, by their reluctance to supply Taurus, by planting in the minds of decision makers in Washington and Berlin a profound worry about escalation. He's saying that Putin's doing well here in this reflexive control area, and he talks about Putin's response to Macron's comments last week about Western troops in Ukraine. And that's why I say I'm looking forward to seeing the reaction to these, or certainly the news about the German intelligence leak. So Phillips OBrien says that, I'm going to quote him, he says, "The amazing thing is that this campaign of reflexive control is working, even though there have been countless unfulfilled Russian nuclear threats over the past 2 years, and many different Russian red lines that Ukraine has crossed. Ukraine has regularly attacked Crimea and many targets inside Russia, and Russia has normally downplayed the attacks after they happen." So this idea, it's a very interesting concept of reflexive control when you think about it. But equally, once you break that, and I think we are on the cusp of breaking it with this thought of, well, what's Russia going to do now if we don't have to wink at each other when we talk about Western boots on the ground inside Ukraine or weapons being used to target inside Russia? I mean, what's Russia going to do? And again, I'm not inviting a nuclear response, of course not. But all he's done so far is rattle the nuclear sabre. It has worked up to now, as Phillips OBrien says. But I just wonder how much that has got left in it, and if there's any other diplomatic or military levers they can pull. I can't see many military levers in Ukraine that Russia's got left, other than mass. And I think in diplomatic terms, they're just waiting, hoping for the alliance, well, it's a very small a alliance because it's not a formal alliance, but the external partners of Ukraine to fracture, waiting for what might happen in the US elections later this year. And you remember the idea in the first few weeks of the war when people were saying, well, of course Russia are going to win. We're not going to go all in supporting Ukraine because what's the point? That went away for about 18 months. And I think it's coming back now. And I just wonder if a number of people are now saying, well, you see, we knew it would happen eventually. I wonder if they're allowing themselves to be subject to this reflexive control that Phillips OBrien talks about in his newsletter today. But go and have a look. Go and read for yourself, see what you think. I thought it was a really interesting contribution to the debate, and seen through the lens of the intelligence failure in Germany and the New York Times article to a lesser extent, a very interesting and timely intervention.
Coming up, we interview a reporter at the Kyiv Independent describing their experience giving birth during an airstrike and their work reporting on the war. The human horror of airstrikes are well documented, with many hospitals being struck by Russian missiles over the past 2 years. But today, David interviews 22-year-old Anastasiia Lapatina, a reporter at the Kyiv Independent, about her experience of giving birth during an airstrike, and her work as a journalist during the full-scale invasion. This is their conversation.
Anastasiia, thank you so much for your time. Let's start your story then on New Year's Eve with the birth of your daughter.
Yeah. Wow. This feels weird because I haven't spoken publicly about this. I haven't even posted a photo on Instagram. The absolute majority of people who know me have no idea that I was even pregnant or had the baby. So, this is cool. Thank you for giving me the chance to talk about it. But my daughter was born. My daughter, Ava, she was born on December 31st, so New Year's Eve at 10:32 in the morning. And it was a crazy time, of course, because, we're in the middle of a war, and people always have conversations before they get pregnant. They talk to their partners about, is this the correct time? Do we want this? Blah, blah, blah. But I feel like not many people talk about, should we be doing this because there's a war happening? How are we going to feel when there are all of these attacks and we have to take care of her and we have to go to a shelter? We need to find a new apartment, and the apartment shouldn't be on one of the top floors because that's more dangerous. So we literally had to change where we live to find a safer place, and all of these conversations. So throughout the pregnancy, it was crazy. It was crazy to have serious thoughts about if there is a chemical attack or if there a tactical nuclear weapon, being dropped on Kyiv, like, what are we going to do? Like, how is that going to impact the pregnancy? Like, those were like actual conversations that we had with my husband. So all of that was like the crazy prelude. But then also, I think like 3 days after I gave birth, we were in the hospital in central Kyiv, and there was one of the biggest attacks, I think, if not the biggest, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion.
Talk us through that. What was the first signs of that you heard?
Right. So, it was another sleepless night with the baby, and we were scrolling through Telegram channels, and we have a bunch of various monitoring, government monitoring, anonymous monitoring, all sorts of monitoring of Russian missiles Telegram channels, and many of them started writing that like, whoa, something really, really bad is about to happen, that take the warnings seriously, because we have air raid alarms, like, almost every day, every other day, and some days it's like 2, 3, 4 of them, and it's like one Russian plane that's doing the refueling, and there is no threat to us, and most people just ignore them. But then sometimes we do get warnings from the government and from non-governmental actors being like, hey, take this one really seriously, because they're actually going to attack. So we started reading all of these messages that like, I don't know, 7, 8 Russian planes are in the air, and they're gonna go. Obviously, if they've been put up in the air, it's not just refueling. If it's like a dozen of them, they're gonna go towards Ukraine. So a huge attack is coming, and that was at night. So they were like, around 5 a.m., 6 a.m., something's gonna happen. So we already knew, right? So we started preparing. Like I'd put like little baby things in the bag and like put it near the exit, and my husband went around and looked at like what's the best place to kind of like take cover and things like that. And then we started going to sleep, and when the air alarm came, I woke my husband, and we started kind of like moving towards shelter. We heard booms. It wasn't as bad in the beginning, so we didn't go to like an actual underground shelter. But then when it got clear that there was like, I think several dozen Russian planes were in the air. Yeah, like I'm pretty sure Telegram told us, I'm not claiming it's 100% accuracy, but I'm pretty sure it was like something close to 20 Russian planes were like sending missiles to Ukraine and to Kyiv.
What time in the morning did you decide to move then?
It was around like 5 or 6 in the morning when the hospital staff moved from just encouraging us to take shelter, like if we want to, they were like, oh no, we're evacuating everybody. Like the doctor who was with me, who helped me deliver, she was like, Nastya, the short version of my name, like, Nastya, get the hell out. Like, you guys are all moving. So we take the baby, take all of the stuff, take food, water, because we have no idea like for how long this is going to last, right? So I'm like stocking up on snacks, and we like go across, like we have to go across the entire hospital. This was the main maternity ward in Kyiv, which means that a bunch of resources flow into it. It's like, really advanced and stuff. And it has a really good, thank God, a really good underground shelter. So we go to that shelter. There's like dozens of really pregnant women, a bunch of women who just gave birth with newborns, their husbands, a bunch of doctors. Everybody's like trying to figure out like where to sit, and like all of us can barely sit at that point, because when you've just given birth you can barely walk, and you have to like figure all of that out. And we're in the shelter, and there are Kinjals, there is the all sorts of missiles. There's like, I'm pretty sure they like flew everything at us at that day, and we were underground and we could still hear the booms, and it lasted for like I think several hours, where we were just sitting there like, trying to feed our babies, trying to calm them, trying to figure it out. And it was ridiculous. And it was really hard with a newborn, but I kept, because I just gave birth and I was still quite traumatized by that. I couldn't even imagine what it's like to be like that pregnant, where you're already at the hospital and you might end up giving birth like literally any second, and you're in this underground shelter because Russia is attacking you. The whole thing was super crazy.
What kind of conversations did you have with people around you? And how was Ava? Was she particularly disturbed, or did she sleep through it?
Oh no, yeah, she slept through. I don't think she still realizes, and I'm really glad she doesn't, what's happening. Like every time we take her, to the corridor because there's an attack, she just like snores more loudly, and it doesn't really bother her, as long as she has her milk. So she's fine. It was crazy because the woman who was near us, like it was me, Ava, my husband, and there was another young family, like around our age, in their 20s, in their early 30s. They just had the baby, and the woman was kind of panicking, like calling her babushka, calling her grandmother, being like, "Oh, are you okay? Are you okay?" And we started seeing these photos of like things that were attacked, because the morning is, it's the early morning, the sun is just up, and we started seeing these photos of like huge chunks of the city just covered with smoke. And we started realizing that like, wow, this isn't just like your average attack. This is like really big. And we start seeing videos of like these, 10, 15 story houses being burned. And it was really scary. To be honest, like the family that was near us, we just kept talking about like baby stuff, like whether the babies were latching or whether the breastfeeding was going fine and like whether you had an epidural. But, in the back of our mind, we were just like so angry because, and I guess that's what's interesting to me. It's like we weren't particularly scared because we felt like reassured that we were in a good spot underneath the hospital. But we were just like so annoyed that like, we just had our babies, like we just want to have like a good freaking time, like we just want to go home and like enjoy this most beautiful moment of our lives, and freaking Russia is doing this again, because there was just anger and disappointment and annoyance, like can this just be over, like we just want to go home.
In the time since that, have you been able to find some peace with your daughter?
Yeah, I did, thankfully to like huge thanks from us to all of the Western supplies, especially the air defense that we have in Kyiv. I've got myself thinking that even though we these days do take cover at night every time there is a potential attack or anything, but I'm rarely actually scared, because thank God the injuries and the losses have been extremely low in Kyiv from Russian attacks, even some of the big ones that we've had. When
your daughter's older, will you tell her about this? How will you tell the story?
Oh, of course. I mean, my husband is Crimean Tatar. So she's, half Crimean Tatar. So she's going to hear a lot of stories about everything the Russians have done to her family. She was named after her great grandmother, Ava. And there are so many people in her family who've been deported by Russia. Her father was and is in the military fighting against Russians. Her mother is a journalist, also in her own way fighting against Russians. So I think Ava is really gonna know, who she can't trust when she grows a bit older to really comprehend it.
Can you tell us a little about your work then, the stories you've worked on? I know in our interview, when you interviewed me, we've flipped this round now. We spoke about the difference we think journalism may make, and sometimes how it feels like it doesn't. But it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that, related to your work.
Well, my experience in journalism, I think, has been extremely weird in a way, because I'm really young. I'm just 22, and I've been in journalism for I think around 3 years or so. So I started working in journalism in Ukraine when I just started my second year of university. I studied abroad at the University of British Columbia in Canada. So, there was COVID, I was at home studying online and working. So for the next 3 years, I continued combining work and school in some capacity, either doing one online and the other in person, or the other way around, taking some breaks, then coming back full time. But it's been really crazy, right? Because, everybody on the university campus with me was just doing their normal 20-year-old things. Meanwhile, I was first just having a very cool job, but then my very cool job turned into a really freaking tragic and traumatic, job experience when the full-scale invasion began. And it was really it was extremely lonely because my degree was political science, right? So everything I'm experiencing was looked at from a very academic point of view, and I had to sit through classes where people were actually evaluating Putin's claims like at face value as if they had any value, like actually considering, but perhaps it was NATO that provoked it, and I had to like somehow calm myself down and then just go cry later because people have no idea what they're talking about. So in a way, journalism was kind of like my escape, right? Because when the full-scale invasion began, it was impossible not to work. Like there was nothing I could do. Like I couldn't really join the military. Of course I could, but I don't think I'm fit enough or to be honest, brave enough to do that. So journalism was kind of like my way out of that helplessness. But there have definitely been moments when I was thinking like, why I probably shouldn't be doing this, right? Like I wrote a piece about, actually, I think it was it was one of the first things I've ever written about the full-scale invasion after it began. It was about a mass grave exhumation in Bucha, when like everybody and their mother was there from the journalism world. There were so many photographers and cameras clicking and like literally journalists from every outlet on earth. And I was standing there looking at, human bodies being piled out of the ground, being dug out of the ground. And it's surreal because you're just standing there, you have to do your job, but I just came back because I was abroad when the invasion began, and I just came back, and I've lived in Irpin my whole life, so it's like right near my home, and I've been to Bucha 1,000 times, and you're sitting there like, I need to do this, and then I have to go write a paper for my politics class and somehow like live in this confused reality, right? And yeah, there were many times where I thought, I was like, why am I doing this? Like people my age don't do this.
Well, what you've just said, it sounds a bit like the same, the anger and confusion of new mothers being forced to, run for shelter because of missiles. In the same way that,
right.
starts with a journalism career, the first thing you do is look at a mass grave. Like that's.
We've been forced into this reality. Like it's crazy because before the full-scale invasion happened, I actually wanted to go work in the Middle East. That was my big dream. In school I was studying, subjects that were one way or another related to the history of countries in the Middle East, to, the wars there. And I actually wanted to be a war correspondent, like not maybe in a military-focused way, but I was really interested in how people managed to live beautiful, happy lives in places like Syria and places like occupied Palestine. People are so gonna hate me for saying that. In all of these war-torn places, and then war came to me, and I kind of first of all had to drop that dream because it's like, well, who at that time, like 2 years ago, before the horrible situation in Israel and Gaza now, I was like, well, who cares anymore? Like everybody cares about Ukraine now. I have to like. Why would I go study Arab studies for masters if I can just do my job at home and like that's the hottest topic possible, right? So that already changed my whole life plan. Like I no longer wanted to study Arabic. I no longer wanted to do all of that because like war came to me. Sorry, I'm yelling. Like war came home, right? And I was like, well, that's... So I was like, I remember thinking like, God, I didn't mean that. You didn't have to do that. Like, you didn't have to bring the word to me.
What's different about doing war journalism than what you thought it might be?
The fact that you get used to it, the fact that when it's happening at home and like you live through it, you get desensitized and you even get tired of it at times, and it just becomes your reality. Like I realized at some point that, and I felt horrible for it, and I still feel horrible about it, and there is some guilt attached to it, but like the stories of, like refugees and people who've lost their homes, like they've become so routine that it no longer incites like the depth of despair in me. And of course it used to, because, again, my mom, for example, our family home is in Irpin. So the first several weeks she was there under Russian nonstop artillery and helicopters and things like that. So the story of refugees used to be like extremely painful for me, but now it's like 8 or 10 million refugees later. I feel like I've heard all of these stories, and it kind of no longer, like, it's just my life now. Like, going to a shelter is just my life now. Like, hiding my baby and, like, packing up my passport, like, it's all just mechanical, you know what I mean? Like, when I hear the air alarm and I'm packing my bag and putting it near the front door, it's just mechanical. Like, it's automatic, you know? And I somehow feel guilty about that.
Speaking to a lot of Ukrainians over the past couple of years, one of the questions I used to sort of ask quite a lot was, plans for the future. Are you making them, not what do you think might happen, but like, how do you sort of conceive of the future? And is it something you're thinking about? Because the response I got quite a lot was, no, you like, stop being insane. You can't do that. Yeah. Is that still the case for you? Like, do you think, now with a daughter, do you sort of, are you forced to think of that and how you do it?
I think that's very much tied to my previous answer, in a way that, because I personally, and I think everybody around me, have gotten so used to this reality, I kind of feel like it's much easier to plan now, because, now, first of all, because I am no longer super idealistic and hopeful about this ending tomorrow or in a month, or, because I remember times when I was having conversations with my friends, asking them to come to Lviv to see me, and they were like, no, we want to be in Kyiv for the victory. Like, this was in April or March or whatever. We genuinely believed, full-heartedly believed that the war was going to end within, weeks or months. Like, somebody genuinely told me they don't want to leave Kyiv because they want to be there to see everybody celebrate and be there for that historic moment. That was 2 years ago. I have no hopes of this ending anytime soon, to be honest. Like, in my mind, I'm prepared for this to be like a very lengthy attritional war where we have no choice but to start planning within this ridiculous context that we have. So yeah, that's kind of that's how my perception shifted for sure since the beginning.
Now you're coming back to doing more hosting and journalistic work. Is there anything in particular you'll be looking at over the next few weeks, next few months? Well,
Avdiivka for sure. We're actually gonna be recording the episode about the fall of Avdiivka tomorrow. Other than that, I mean, to be honest, what's happening in the US is really concerning, especially because I'm really interested in American politics, and I listen to a lot of podcasts and read up a lot about what's happening in the US. I have a lot of friends there, a lot of colleagues there, so what's happening in Congress is really, really disappointing and really worrisome, because I think a lot of people don't actually realize just how bad the situation is. And that's something that our politicians are talking about now in the context of Avdiivka specifically. I don't think that's entirely true, but they're kind of blaming the whole thing on the West, right? On the lack of ammunition, on the lack of supplies. And I can't even imagine what's going to happen if this persists, and we're going to be months and months into the blocked flow of aid from the US. Things might be really, really dark. I mean, I'm seeing online people talking about a potential, another invasion from Belarus or something. And I don't know how much of it is just like some crazy Russian propaganda or whatever, but it's definitely out there on the streets. People are talking about it. People are scared.
Anastasia, is there anything we haven't spoken about you think is important, you want our listeners to hear?
I mean, to be fair, now with my new role as a mother, not to kind of continue, beating down on that topic, but I'm genuinely in awe of all of the mothers in Ukraine, because this is definitely one of those things where, unless you actually go through it, you have no idea what that's like. Because, people abroad probably think that about any Ukrainian in general, they have no idea what war is like until they've actually lived through it. But, being in the middle of a war and having somebody to care for is a whole another thing, especially in the context of, hundreds of thousands of men being in the military and mothers being alone. I started seriously, considering donating to those specific charities that target that demographic, to women with kids, to women with the newborns, to pregnant women, because that's just I encourage everybody to not romanticize that whole process and time, because it's, especially in the context of Ukraine, it's extremely traumatizing and stressful and terrible to have to go through like what should be the happiest day, moments, weeks, months of your life to this ridiculous anxiety that we have. So my heart really goes out to all of the mothers in Ukraine and also all mothers abroad in all sorts of contexts in Gaza, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Iraq.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Ukraine the Latest. Your support and attention means a great deal. Just in case you didn't know, The Telegraph runs another podcast you may be interested in. Battle Lines is our weekly global affairs and defence podcast, where we look at conflicts and unrest around the world with The Telegraph's foreign desk. On Battle Lines, you'll hear updates and news on everything, from the violence in the Middle East and Red Sea, civil wars in Sudan and Myanmar, to unrest in Ecuador. Join Roland Oliphant, Sophia Yan and Natalia Vasilyeva on Battle Lines, published every Friday, with occasional segments by myself and other contributors to this podcast. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war ramps up, we are relying on your support more than ever. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X, formerly known as Twitter. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter and Georgia Cohen. Executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.